I think that almost everyone here knows Ann Meredith. Last week she was here to start a 4-week series on world religions, and she talked to us about beliefs and practices of Hindus. And today she's going to talk about Buddhism. If you don't know Ann, she is a University of Rochester professor and teaches a variety of classes in religion and history. I'm correct about that. So welcome again. She's going to be here for the next 2 weeks. So
Today and then tomorrow.
today and 2 more weeks after this. Great. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you. I feel like next week I'll feel like I'm swimming in a pond I've been in before, because that speaks Judaism. That's, so I'm outside of my areas of expertise here. So welcome. I hope you all have your snacks ready for the Super Bowl, since we don't care who wins. So I'm focusing on the snacks. So this is okay, so today we're going to talk about Buddhism, but in order to talk about Buddhism, I'm going to go back a little bit and remind you about Hinduism a little bit. So Hinduism is the oldest traditions that we know of on the Indian, or the things that later came to be called Hinduism. Were the oldest religions that we knew on the Indian subcontinent. And at the time though, right, it was known as the Vedic traditions based on the Vedas. And the Vedas, the early Vedas, consisted mostly of rituals and hymns and songs and prayers and instruction for doing all of the things that you need to do in order to worship the gods. If you remember, there's a part of the Veda that's sometimes called the Vedanta, which means the end of the Veda, but which is more frequently called the Upanishads. So that's part of the Veda. That was one of the sacred texts that we talked about. And in the Upanishads, that already reflected a kind of shift in Vedic religions and traditions, or Hinduism. And this is around 600 BCE, 800 or 400 BCE. You have the writing of the Upanishads, and these focus much more on those kind of abstract philosophical ideas that we talked about, right? The Brahman is the energy, the divine force that's in the universe, and we all have within us a soul, an Atman, which is actually Brahman, right? And all of that. And so focusing on those kinds of questions. So you already had a kind of movement toward moving away from ritual and things like that, moving towards these kind of more philosophical, abstract kind of questions. And there were, in fact, at that time, a lot of people who were concerned about the caste system, for example, concerned about a whole range of issues, concerned about the power that the priestly class, the Brahmins, had. They felt that the traditions were too ritualistic. So there was some discontent in general anyways. So then that is going to bring us to Buddha. And I'm going to start the story of Buddhism because, as we talked about with Hinduism, there's no central founder, there's no central religious authority, right? It's these smaller collection of everyday kind of rituals around making offerings to the gods, as well as these more philosophical insights. But in the case of Buddha, we do have a figure that the religious scholar Max Weber would refer to as a charismatic spiritual teacher, right? This notion of charismatic authority, as opposed to a priest who has their authority, even if they're interpersonally a dud, just simply by virtue of their office, right? So people have different kinds of spiritual authority. There's sort of priestly authority because of the position. There's technical expertise. That's why you invite me here. And then you have people who have charismatic authority. And a lot of religious leaders are thought about as having charismatic authority. So Buddha really is the founder of Buddhism. So, and part of the knowledge of Buddhism comes from his life story. So the Buddha's name, which means the enlightened one, the awakened one, Buddha's name was Siddhartha Gautama. And if any of you grew up in the, well, you didn't grow up in the 60s and 70s, I did, but in the 60s and 70s, everybody was reading Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha and all of those. Well, I, of course, read all those. So all those books, but I do recommend, it's a great book if you're interested in it. And so Siddhartha Gautama, and he was born in 563 in a region, in a village, kind of a small kingdom in Nepal, in the small kingdom in the foothills of the Himalayas. And he was a prince. He was born into the royal family of this kingdom. He was a prince, and his father was very protective. So the legend, so the tale goes, his father was very protective and kept him very sheltered within the confines of the royal grounds and the royal palace. He eventually gets married and he has a child. But he starts feeling just deep dissatisfaction, dissatisfaction with life, not really knowing about life because he was raised in such a kind of a protected, precious environment. And so he decides, eventually, he decides to go outside. He's able to leave the palace walls. And he goes outside, and as the legend, as the narrative has it, he goes outside and he ends up seeing what come to be known as the four sights, the four visions, the four sights. What he sees is an old man, which reminded him that everybody gets old. He saw a sick man, reminding him of the suffering and the pain that comes into every life because of illness and physical suffering. He saw a corpse signifying death, which many people fear, but there's no way to avoid it, the inescapable reality of mortality. And he also saw a wandering ascetic who planted the idea in his mind that you could use asceticism in order to try to achieve liberation. So he saw all these sights, and it made him reflect on the human experience, and especially suffering as a fundamental part of that experience. So he embarked for the next years. He became a wandering ascetic, and it lived a life of extreme deprivation and spiritual discipline. And so he wanted to learn from other teachers. He wanted to engage in disciplined spiritual activities. And he practiced extreme forms of self-denial, minimal food, long periods of meditation, right? All this in the aims of trying to achieve enlightenment. And he did not achieve enlightenment at that point. And so he quickly decided, he was like, well, 7 years, that's it. No, but at the age of 35, if I don't get enlightenment in 7 years, I'm done. But at the age of 35, he starts to question whether or not this intense deprivation and asceticism is indeed the path to true liberation. And he develops what he calls the middle path. So Buddhism, he is calling the middle path. Neither a life of extreme opulence and indulgence and pleasure seeking, nor one of extreme asceticism. Those are not necessary and not useful towards trying to achieve liberation and breaking free from the kind of cycle of samsara, the idea that we get from Hinduism, from this cycle of life and death. So he comes to this awareness as the legend goes. He's sitting under the Bodhi tree and he's meditating, and he has this experience. And while he's there, in the typical aspect of the journey, of the sort of hero's journey or the spiritual master, he's tested by all sorts of spirit beings and demons that try to test him, just like Jesus is tested out in the wilderness, right? This is a common feature of spiritual journey tales. And he has this awareness of the middle path. And what he comes up with is what comes to be known as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. These are the key aspects of the central aspects of his teaching, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So those are the central aspects of his teaching. And he ends up spending the rest of his life gathering a community of followers around him, teaching, being a spiritual teacher, and cultivating really meditation, mindfulness, and compassion as central to the spiritual life. So as the legend goes, he died in India at the age of 80, so 483 BCE. And Buddhism starts to spread. And one of the reasons why it starts to spread is it starts to get imperial patronage. Somebody who was Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, who was an emperor of a small kingdom, really put a lot of money and effort, was really taken by the teachings of the Buddha into spreading it, building shrines, etc. So he's considered a very important figure, kind of like Constantine, right? Would Christianity have made it if Constantine hadn't converted, right? So would Buddhism have made it, or would it have just been one of the many early variations of Hinduism, for example, if it hadn't been for Ashoka? So Ashoka ends up promulgating it and spreading and paying for spiritual communities. Okay, so what were his ideas? What were the key ideas that Buddha realized after these years of meditation and that are central to Buddhist understanding of the world and how to release yourself from the cycle of suffering and from birth, the cycle of birth and rebirth and so on and so forth? And at the heart of Buddhism lies what are called the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are not within Buddhism just intellectual concepts, but basically they are something you have to deeply realize and live as if they're fundamental guiding ideas for your life that shape your spiritual practice so that you can become liberated. So what are those? So the first noble truth is, right, it's obviously said lots of times, people, that all life is suffering. All is suffering. That suffering, being dissatisfied, not just physical pain. I'll talk about the different kinds of suffering, but being having discontent, realizing you can't take it with you. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent. And it addresses the fact that life is full of sadness, it's full of loss, it's full of pain, it's full of guilt, it's full of sorrow, it's full of a lot of difficult things. Life is very difficult. And he even said, even pleasure is even in a deep way, pleasure is still a kind of suffering because it's temporary, right? It can't last. You're constantly reminded of the fleeting nature of the pleasures. Also, pretend you'd be like, oh, pretend you're like a child and your dream is to have candy all the time. Well, we as adults know, you eat a bunch of candy, you don't want it anymore, right? It's become suffering if that's all you can do, right? And even, oh, I just want to be lazy. I don't want to do anything all day. Well, a year into my empty nest, I was sort of like, oh, okay. I'm appreciating not having to do the grind with children anymore. But then you realize like, oh, okay, well, maybe there's something missing here. So that even pleasure, even things that you like or love can end up, and because you fear losing them, like your children or your family or your relationships, even that is suffering. And within that truth, he taught that there's three kinds of suffering. Physical suffering, right? So pain, hunger, illness, aging, physical discomfort. So there's physical suffering, emotional suffering, any kind of sadness, grief, frustration, fear, anxiety, anger. Emotional discipline is very difficult. And those emotions can overtake you. We're suffering, certainly on college campuses, an incredible amount of anxiety and depression among our students. It's I look back at my own time and I was like, I was so joyful and carefree in college. I never thought about anything. I never thought about getting a job, but I was a religion major. Gonna hire me. So, I just never even thought about it. These kids are so anxious and so full of tension. So, so you've got physical suffering, you've got emotional suffering, and then also what we might call existential suffering, right? This existential unease when we don't know what's going on in the world. Everything's transient. How do we find meaning in this world? Everything is going to be subject to decay and loss, a kind of existential homelessness that people experience. Do I belong here? does this have any meaning? How can, this kind of existential suffering. So you've got physical suffering, emotional suffering, and existential suffering. And one of the things is you might be like, well, this is a tough start to a religion, right? It's just being like, hey, it's all bad, right? It's all suffering. But rather, it's not so much as a way for you to start despairing once you realize this, but to realize that to some extent it's because we're attached to all these things. We're attached to things. We have connections to things. And remember the importance of detachment in the Bhagavad Gita, in that idea in Hinduism, that you do your work without any attachment to the fruits of that labor. And that's very difficult to do. So it's supposed to, this first truth is supposed to just make you aware that yes, and also in a way, I think it kind of universalizes it. You realize like, okay, I'm not the only one suffering. That's one of the things that I've learned, that, you know, if I speak up and just say something like, is it cold in here? Maybe it is cold in here, right? You know, just as something, you know, that it's shared. Suffering is also shared. Okay, so then the next, connected to the fact that all is suffering, and I think I already kind of moved into it, is what is the cause of suffering? And the cause of suffering is desire, is craving. Craving or desire, and you said it, and also ignorance, right? You're ignorant. You think buying that fancy car is going to bring you happiness. You think, you know, you don't understand what the true sources of joy and peace and contentment and happiness are. So, and liberation. You don't understand that. You're fundamentally ignorant. But mostly craving or desire, a constant yearning for pleasure, for new experiences, for possessions, right? All these things that outside of ourselves that we think are going to bring us happiness, and that we crave things. And I would like to point out that one of the fascinating, I like to see, you know, different kinds of connections to things is, if you recall to mind the 10 Commandments, a lot of obvious ones: don't kill, don't steal, etc. And then you have that commandment about coveting. And coveting is this idea, right, of craving something, wanting something so badly it might lead you to sin, within the Jewish and Christian language, to sin because you want it so much. This like notion of craving. And you also have, in a very famous scholar of religion, Rene Girard, in where he talks about violence in a society, and he says that violence in a society often comes from what he calls mimetic desire, mimesis, mimetic desire, which is this idea that you want something that somebody else has or somebody else is, right? You're more beautiful than I am. You're more intelligent than I am. You have a better car. Karen's got heated seats, right? So you've got, right, and this, he said, it's about how something in a society that you need to do is to figure out how to contain that, right? That, you know, that can lead to violence, and it's in his book called Violence as Sacred. So, it can lead to all kinds of things. So I find it fascinating that you find in contemporary scholars, in ancient Jewish texts, here in this Buddhist insight, this notion that desiring, craving, wanting, right, so is something that is going to lead you to unhappiness and in the wrong direction. And we need to kind of discipline those desires. And again, there's three kinds of craving. Craving for sensory pleasure. We all want that. We all want yummy food. We all want pleasurable sex. We all want the joy of sloth and laziness. We all want, you know, we want to see beautiful things. We want to hear beautiful things, right? That's going to give us pleasure. We want to eat things. We want to, you know, all of these kinds of things. And so then you become attached to these things and these, right? Just for pleasure, the craving for pleasure. Also, just the craving for existence, right? We're desperate to stay alive. We're desperate for the people that we love to stay alive, for our pets to stay alive, right? The craving for existence, right? You're clinging to existence without realizing, right? Death is just a natural part of life, a natural part of life. So the desire to cling to life. But also you have some Buddhist teachers who have expanded that, and the existence in a certain kind of way. So a craving for a certain status, right? That's something that, for example, I don't know if any of you are retired or if you've experienced it when you retired, but lots of people experience a kind of sense of loss when they retire, right? You know, well, gosh, I used to be a professor, you know, or something like that. And now what am I? You know, when I'm getting my oranges at Wegmans and I used to be a professor, right? You know, but clinging to that kind of status or who you were, or kind of, you know, that is also a kind of existence. So not just existence itself, but a type of existence. And then also, frankly, the reverse, craving for non-existence and for not becoming engaged in the world, trying to avoid unpleasant situations, trying to avoid pain, trying to avoid, rather than just allowing yourself to feel them, act appropriately, you know, avoid unpleasant emotions. Obviously, an extreme part of that would be if you're in such an intense situation of, you know, depression or pain or something like that, and actually longing for non-existence. So all of these things, craving for existence, craving for non-existence, craving for sensory pleasure. And also connected to this is ignorance, right? You have a fundamental ignorance about how the world works, that you think you have it in you to make things last forever, or you don't, right? So releasing that kind, you know, that kind of desire for that ignorance that I would say leads to a desire to control. And that's also kind of interesting. I'm just reading with some students some Epicurean philosophy. And the Epicureans, they kind of emerged a little bit later than the Stoics. And one of the fundamental insights of Epicurean philosophy is this notion of hope and fear are two sides of the same coin. People are nervous and anxious. They're hopeful for their future. They fear the unknown and the future. And in the views of the Epicureans, one way to quell your fear or diminish it is through knowledge, right? And it makes you think of PBS, you know, the more you know what that do, right? The more you know, the less fearful you will be. Right, so education is not and reading and thinking and learning, right, is not only an intellectual exercise, it's an emotional exercise, right? This is not people who think that ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is confusion, vulnerability to people who want to prey on your ignorance, right? I mean, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance contributes to fear and anxiety. I don't know what's going on, what's happening. So, so part of this craving is, what's the source of craving the wrong things? Ignorance. So you've got all is suffering. Suffering is caused by craving or desire. But that also, you can, there can be a cessation to that suffering. You can have an end to that suffering. And it's not an end to your existence, but an extinction of the root causes of your suffering, which are that craving or that attachment to earthly and worldly things and people and experiences that you cannot take with you, and ignorance, right? So there is an end. So he introduces this notion of nirvana, which I think is what everybody associates with. It's, you know, a name of a 90s grunge band. People say like, oh, that, you know, that dessert was so delicious. I was in nirvana, right? The state of blissful happiness and peace. And nirvana, interestingly, is not a state, right? It means, you know, to be awakened. Nirvana is, it also can mean to like be blown out, right? So, but it's not an experience that can be described in positive terms. Buddha often spoke about nirvana as in negative terms, what Christian theologians would call the via negativa, right? The way of you can't really explain what God is. In a way, you can only explain what God isn't, right? You see a lot of that in Russian Orthodox theology and in the novels of Dostoevsky, if you're interested in that. So via negativa. So it's a state of kind of blissful peace and freedom, but it's because you've realized in a way the emptiness of things. Not that nothing matters or that everything matters, but in a way, whether nothing matters or everything matters, you are going to die. You are going to be released from, right? And you need to be focused on the right things. So it's, we think of it as sort of pure bliss or pure happiness, but even that, it's more, I would say, a feeling of calmness, of being at peace, right? It's not joy, right? It's not that, that's a different kind of feeling. But a kind of freedom, liberation, not feeling attached to things inappropriately, and you can achieve that. So that all life is suffering, all suffering is caused by craving and ignorance, but you can achieve a cessation of that suffering and you can achieve nirvana. And the fourth thing leads us into his solution. The fourth one is there is a path. There is a path out of suffering. And right action, right thinking, right feeling, cultivating that, developing that way of living and being, that is the way out of the cycle. And to eliminate craving, to eliminate ignorance and attachment. And so you need to follow this path. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about then is this path. What is the basic path? And I'm going to talk about this path, and then that really is the core of Buddhist teaching. There's many other things, but you may have also heard of variations, right? Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. So I'm going to switch over to talking about the differences between those kinds, so because you can oftentimes hear those kinds of words. So, Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. All suffering is caused by craving and desire and ignorance. You can stop that and end up in nirvana. The way to do that is through the Eightfold Path. So what is the Eightfold Path then? The Eightfold Path are 8 interconnected factors, ways of being, and they themselves are categorized into 3 major groups: forms of wisdom, forms of ethical conduct, and forms of mental discipline. And again, that notion of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. That reminds me also, because I'm teaching about the Stoics and Epicureans, about the Stoics, who also argue, right? But there's a lot of things about Stoicism that's very similar to Buddhism, right? The reason we're suffering in life is because we're super happy about this, and then we're super bummed about this, and then this is wrong, and I'm trying for this, and I want it. No, Stoics like, you can't do that. Everything is fated. It will unfold out. All you can control is yourself and your reaction to it. And so you need to cultivate a discipline of mind and emotion in order to peacefully move through the world. That's what you need to be doing. So there's a lot of similarities in a way to Stoic teachings, I find, in Buddhism as well. Okay, so let's talk about these different paths. So the first are 2 elements of wisdom: right understanding and right intention. So the first step is right understanding. And basically, if you accept the 4 Noble Truths, you understand what they are, right? You need to have a right understanding. Why are you suffering? Oh, I'm suffering because I didn't get that job I wanted. No, you're suffering because you wanted that job, right? That's why, and you can't just let it go. So you recognize that suffering is inherently a part of life, and that it's caused by your attachment and your desire. And so that's the first step on the path, is awareness and understanding these kind of concepts. And it's not as if you don't do the one and then the next and then the next, right? You can't imagine them that way, but you're working on all of these at a time. So the next then is right intention, right? You have to have the proper attitude. You have to have the proper intention, right? People can embark on spiritual journeys for all sorts of wrong reasons. And you have to make sure that you have the right intention. And the right intention is an intention that is benevolent and not malevolent, bringing goodness into the world, bringing compassion into the world, and generosity. Those are key aspects. And you have to get rid of anger, competition, hatred, greed, and you have to shape your journey by a desire for compassion, for peace, for kindness, for ethical behavior, right? These that you have to cultivate the right and proper intention. And part of that, in certain forms of Buddhism, which I'll talk about in a minute, is wanting enlightenment for everybody else too. That you need to cultivate, this is part, not all Buddhists argue this way, but you want to also work in your spiritual journey to help other people come to, not in a missionary way, not like I'm going to convert you, there's no such thing in Buddhism, but rather that I'm here to help you on your journey. So that's part of it as well. So you've got right thinking, right intention, and then you've got ethical conduct, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So right speech involves disciplining your speech, speaking truthfully, kindly, and constructively, avoiding gossiping, avoiding insulting people, harsh language, divisive speech, being rude, all kinds of forms of disciplining your speech. And I find that particularly interesting. And again, I hope this isn't annoying people, just finding analogs with other traditions. If you look in the book of Proverbs and within the Jewish wisdom tradition, there's various different things that cultivate wisdom and piety in the wisdom tradition. And one thing that is the sheer amount and the intense emphasis on disciplining your speech. You know, it's a more complex version. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? Speak with compassion, speak with kindness, disciplining your speech. And one of the things I like about Proverbs is it acknowledges the difficulty of, there's a great verse where it says, everybody loves gossip. It's like a little tasty morsel, right? And and it's like, oh, and you think about, oh, juicy gossip, right? We use that kind of language, like, oh, I mean, who doesn't, you know, I like a little bit of gossip. I mean, when I get together, for example, when I went home for Christmas, I was hanging with my high school friends, so still my best friends, and you know, time gossiping about like, oh, do you remember Janie from blah, 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 blah. She's now running a, you know, fitness club or like whatever. That sometimes we're like, well, we're not gossiping, it's just information exchange, but but it's hard to discipline your speech, and you find that a lot of traditions, right? That slow to speech, slow to talk. You don't have to say everything all the time. Try being in a faculty meeting. It's like, yeah, I already said that. You don't also need to say it. I mean, more people love to hear themselves talk. So I have a new practice of saying nothing in faculty meetings unless I am asked. So right speech, truthfulness, gentleness, compassionate communication. How do you talk to people, etc. So right speech, and again, you find that in many traditions. And then obviously right action, right? No, one of the first precepts is I will harm no other living being, right? So obviously the obvious kinds of, you know, killing, stealing, what you might think of as the obvious sort of moral, ethical actions, morally responsible behavior. But it's not just not stealing, etc. But are you acting in ways that are increasing the harmony in the world? It's not just not doing the bad things. It's also, are you behaving in ways that are generous, that are compassionate, that are helpful, that are kind, that are increasing harmony? Are you doing those kinds of things? And so in Buddhist ethics in real world terms, right? Obviously things like feeding the poor and altruism and all of those kinds of things are fundamentally important. And we're doing your part to craft a harmonious community. And you can think about that as your home, as a harmonious home, this community, your town, your country, right? The community of human beings, right? At every level, how are you contributing to that? So, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right? That you have a response. Can anybody be a Buddhist? Well, I think Buddha would say that some professions are not, you cannot perform them and be living a Buddhist life. So back in the day, for example, working in a slaughterhouse, like that would be, that was, slaughtering animals, for example. But anything that has to do with weapons, with violence, so police officers, anything like that. You have many modern people suggesting that people who are, I don't know, investment bankers, right? I mean, anyway, like how are you structurally, is your, you need to think very carefully about your work. And again, you see this in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is basically saying like, we don't really know what we're doing in life. It doesn't seem like good people always win. It seems like sometimes bad people flourish. How can you live? And in the book of Ecclesiastes, and one of the most important pieces of advice is pick meaningful work. Pick meaningful work. And I try to tell this to my young people that I teach. Pick meaningful work, because you don't want to be in a soul sucking job. So, but you also for yourself, but also so that you're contributing to communities of harmony, right? So teaching and healthcare and anything that contributes to creating harmony and goodness and compassion and kindness and helping people, that it's important, right? So you can't just be any job in a way. I'm sure you could, right? You could, adopt a Buddhist lifestyle, but Buddha would basically say, you spend a lot of time at work. Spend a lot of time at work. And Ecclesiastes says that too, right? You spend a lot of time at work. Pick work for your own sake. I say to the students, if it's meaningful, makes you happy, and then that also is contributing to the good of the world. So right livelihood, which is interesting because I don't think you see that in a lot of traditions where it's saying basically, right, we oftentimes, especially in the United States, when we think about the division between church and state and private life and our work life, or something like that. We don't have a lot of conversation about like, is it moral to be in certain professions or not, right? And obviously we don't want to contribute to division by saying like, how could you be a police officer or something like that? I mean, I'm just using that as an example that people have given, because those are the people of weapons in our society. But it's interesting that it basically is forcing you to say, think about the work you choose to do. And then the last three have to do with mental discipline, right? It's hard to control your emotions. It's hard to control your desire. It's hard, this takes an enormous amount of discipline, but the emphasis is less on, in a way, physical discipline that you associate with asceticism, which he argued was, that did not seem to him to be the path to liberation and to nirvana for Buddha, but rather mental discipline. So these are right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And I actually think these are not that well distinguished. But effort, right? You have to always be trying, always be focused on this. Can you focus? Can you maintain your clarity? Can you keep trying, right? Even though you slip up and end up gossiping with your friends, right? Right effort, right? Work, you have to be trying. And one of the things that's fascinating is sometimes there's been critiques of Buddhism as if it's just people sitting up on mountains passively waiting for enlightenment to come to them, or so, to enter into some blissful state of nirvana. And I think Buddha really emphasizes, it takes an enormous amount of mental discipline, right? That it's just very difficult to keep these truths in your mind and to keep these ethical standards going. So how do you do that in a way? What do you need to be concentrating on? Mindfulness and meditation, right? So this was one of the things that Buddha basically argues, right? Anybody can meditate, anybody, right? It's not just the priests. It's not just the people who are going to be gurus or yogis or whatever. Anybody can meditate. Anybody can do that to cultivate their proper mental discipline and to move towards those states of nirvana. Anybody could do that. And so that's one of the things that you have to do. You have to cultivate through meditation clear awareness of thoughts and feelings and situations. And this would be something where this is where it really goes deeper, right? I don't have a problem with right ethical action or, and as I get older, it's much easier for me, for example, to, like keep my mouth shut. Like, I don't need to hear myself talk and things like that. But part of the thing about mental discipline is it's not that you're thinking something gossipy and you just don't say it. I mean, that's obviously better. Or you're thinking something mean, or somebody's bugging you, or whatever it is in your life, or you're feeling anger, but you have enough control not to express it in certain ways. Right, Buddhism is asking you to do something more. You only have kind thoughts, right? That is it's not just ethical action, right? You can only be, right, you have to truly think these things. So when somebody's bothering you, your first thought needs to be one of kindness, or somebody's cutting you off, has to be a thought of generosity, not oh, you moron, rage, but then I don't do anything, right? Just because I'm not then tailgating him because after he cut me off or something. That doesn't mean I'm all the way there, because I'm wishing that I would, and like secretly hoping he gets a ticket, and I mean, all the things that you might be thinking, right? So this actually, I think, is the difficult part. Many people, and if you think about that, this has some similarities in a way with Jesus, which is that Jesus takes Jewish law and he says, right, you've heard it say, don't kill. Well, I say, don't even be angry. Well, I mean, I'm hoping none of us have killed anybody. How many of us have not been angry at somebody, right? I would venture to say none of us. We've all been angry. But that's the deeper ask, right? Don't even be angry. Don't even be angry. Jesus says, you've heard, don't commit adultery. I say, don't even have lustful thoughts. Don't even, right? So that kind of right mindfulness, I think is obvious for me. Maybe I'm revealing too much about myself. That's the difficult part, right? Become aware of those things, train yourself out of them so that you're not just thinking a bunch of things, feeling a bunch of things, that at least you're grown up enough and have enough personal control that you're not saying everything that you think, you know what I mean? And so that idea, if you don't have something nice to say, then don't say anything. Well, you should, truly cultivating the sense that I only have nice things to say. And then the last one is concentration, right? That you have to not just be aware, not just try, but really it takes intense concentration and spiritual discipline and focus to achieve any moments in this life of, right, what you want eventually is sustained bliss, right? Sustained awareness. But you can, at various points in your journey on this path, have moments of clarity, moments of ease, moments of liberation, moments, aha kind of moments where you have this realization that, then it's snowy out, you got a shovel, right? And things, things distract you from that. Life distracts you from that. So you have to maintain what's called sama samadhi, intense concentration, focus, meditation, right? All of those things kind of go together. So that is the Eightfold Path, right? So you have to have right emotional states, you have to have right mental states, you have to have right action. So I would say that those ideas are core to all different forms of Buddhism. And then you have different types of Buddhism that have developed. People have probably heard of Zen Buddhism. We have a Zen center. They've probably heard of Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, things like that. So I just want to briefly talk about the different kinds of Buddhism. So the original kind of Buddhism of Buddha has now come to be called Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, which is known also as the teaching of the elders. Theravada Buddhism, this is a strict focus on the Four Noble Truths and on the Eightfold Path. These are people who are kind of originalists. They want to focus on the earliest writings, on the earliest teachings of Buddha. And it places a strong emphasis on individual enlightenment through personal effort, meditation, and following the path laid out by Buddha. So this is just what you might think of as standard foundational Buddhism. That's Theravada Buddhism. The next kind of Buddhism that developed, so if Buddha's living in the 6th century, dies in the 5th century, the Emperor Ashoka is living in the 3rd century. These are all BCE dates, right? That's the only kind of Buddhism that you have there for a few hundred years. Then you move into the 1st century, and there develops a kind of Buddhism that comes to be called Mahayana Buddhism, which Theravada Buddhism is also sometimes called Hinayana Buddhism. So Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. Mahayana means the greater vehicle. Obviously, Theravada Buddhists are not calling themselves Hinayana Buddhists. They're not like, we're going the easy route. They're not doing that. But basically, the main thing that is different, there's many things, couple little small things that are different, but the main thing that is different about Mahayana Buddhism is the cultivating the ideal of the Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva is a being, a guru, a spiritual teacher who it is believed has achieved, is one step away, right? Has achieved nirvana, but has put off his final sort of liberation in order to help everybody else, in order to be a teacher and a spiritual guide. And this very much emphasizes this idea that you have a little bit in Theravada Buddhism, in the Buddhist teachings, but really explodes in Mahayana Buddhism, that in a way, that notion of unless everyone's free, I can't be free, right? And so it's that notion, unless everybody's liberated, can I truly be liberated? Can I truly achieve nirvana? And so it's a deep, intense form of compassion that these great spiritual teachers who come to be known as bodhisattvas, that these bodhisattvas put off their kind of release into nirvanic bliss in order to write and to teach and to gather a community of followers around them. And so they wants to work towards the well-being of all spiritual beings. So in a way, the Dalai Lama, in a way, might be conceptualized as a kind of bodhisattva, even though he's part of Tibetan Buddhism. So the emphasis is really on compassion for other beings who are also on a spiritual journey. Then the next kind of Buddhism is Tibetan Buddhism. And these, of course, are developed as a result of regionalisms and things like that, but they end up developing in different directions. Tibetan Buddhism is interesting. You take these teachings of Mahayana Buddhism with the Bodhisattva ideal, and they become connected to various different kinds of rituals that were previous esoteric notions, that there's secret teachings, secret rituals that you often found in tantric Hinduism. So various forms of Hinduism that incorporate shamanic elements, maybe going on a spiritual journey, visualization, using mantras, very specific meditation techniques. And they also further expand their interest in spiritual teachers. So you have the development of the system of lamas, which are spiritual teachers. So we have the Dalai Lama, or the practice of what has come to be called guru yoga, right? Where you're not just practicing yoga, you have a spiritual teacher who is not only teaching you the various asanas or poses, but all the spiritual teachings, and you develop a very close relationship. We talked about how those relationships can be and have been exploited over the years by many people, but this is central to Tibetan Buddhism, including this system of reincarnated lamas or spiritual teachings, right? That it keeps coming back, inhabited in a new body, in order to help the community of people, help through his teaching, through his compassion, through his wisdom, through his spreading of the ideals of Buddhism, is contributing to the liberation of everybody. So, and you mostly find that in Nepal, in Tibet, and it also has come to the West a little bit because of the fame of the Dalai Lama. So you have Tibetan Buddhism. And then the last kind of major kind of Buddhism is called Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism actually emerges out of, we associate that mostly with Japan, but Zen Buddhism actually emerged in the 800s, 700 and 800s out of Chan Buddhism. And it emphasizes direct experience over theoretical knowledge. And you get that through sitting and through silence and through stillness. So they very much emphasize what they call a sitting practice, right? They might, meditation, but they call it a sitting practice. They'll have silent retreats, things like that. They also very much emphasize the importance of a Zen master, a Zen teacher, right? A guide, somebody that who you will follow. So zazen is the word for seated meditation. But they also argue you can't, in a way, on the way, it's a sort of effort, non-effort, right? So think about somebody who a ballerina who trains and trains and trains and trains to do what? To make it look effortless, right? And to some extent, then it does become effortless because you've done it for so long. So too with Zen Buddhism. You're going to train, you're going to train, you're going to train, you're going to meditate, engage in a seated sitting practice for years and years and years. But it's not like you could be like, and then you do step 5 and then step 10, right? And then you're getting enlightenment. They emphasize that it's going to come to you spontaneously. It's going to come to you instantly, a kind of realization. And that realization might be transient. You have to work at it again, right? Through the seated meditation, but stillness and in a way, sort of opening yourself up and opening your mind up to the universe is key to Zen Buddhism. So some ways in which that's manifested itself historically is over artistic practices that emphasize stillness and focus, things like Zen calligraphy, for example, certain kinds of Zen brushwork, and that's an art that is developed by Zen monks, tea ceremonies, Zen gardens, right? There's some, right, the being part of creating harmony and growth and beauty, but also ordered. If you think about walking through a Zen garden, and also koans. So I had a book of koans. My dad gave me a book of koans once when I was young, and I absolutely loved reading them. So koans are these little riddles, right? And reflection on these riddles is supposed to give you a kind of aha experience. So the most famous koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? We know the sound of two hands clapping. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That's the most famous one. But another one, I think I included, I'm not sure, is one where a man has fallen and he's holding on to a vine. And there's a tiger above him and there's a tiger below him.
What's he gonna do?
And exactly, what's he gonna do? And then 2 mice come and they start chewing on the vine, right? And all of a sudden, a strawberry catches his eye. He picks the strawberry and goes, this is so delicious. And that's the story, right? So the point is, right, so you're sort of saying, what's the point of that story? Well, the point is very obviously that even in this moment, imminent before his death, right? Probably not going to be a great death either. It's going to, be eaten alive by a tiger. Not a great death. Yeah, but that strawberry's there. Why don't you enjoy that? Enjoy, right? Be in the moment. Be here now. So, but it's hard for us to grasp that. It's hard for, I'd be terrified if I was hanging on a vine, even without the tiger. So, it's these riddles and these kinds of, quippy kind of things that you're supposed to then meditate upon in order to help you release your mind, right? A kind of lateral thinking, spiritual lateral thinking puzzles, so to speak, that you meditate upon. Your master might give you, your teacher might give you a koan that you would meditate upon. So Zen Buddhism, it started in China, but it really has exploded mostly in Japan. And because of books written by Shunri Suzuki and D.T. Suzuki. He was very, very famous. Books of koans. Alan Watts. He was a kind of American spiritual thinker who was very into Zen Buddhism, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that book that came out. Right, all of those, right, it became very popular in the West. So, Zen Buddhism is also very popular. We have a great Zen center, here in town. So then the last thing I want to mention, you guys have a couple minutes, are just the kinds of, what are the kinds of things about Buddhism that some people that come up when you talk about Buddhism? So number one is, and this is true with Hinduism as well, the co-optation of Buddhist ideas in the West. And you've got people engaged in meditation, just for a kind of mental clarity and wellness, and it's not attached to the spiritual teachings of Buddhism. And, some people might even be meditating and hoping to gain mental clarity so that they can gain wealth, right? Or so they can be, more effective at their, right? This is not correct, right? So there's this kind of watering down, stereotyping of Buddhists as kind of, peaceful hippies who are kind of detached from the world, right? There's all sorts of things that happen when religious traditions are adapted piecemeal and co-opted. So true when Christianity is co-opted and adapted in other places. So that kind of Westernization, and it's kind of like with yoga, right? People engaging in yoga without reading the spiritual teachings and things like that. So, and just wanting it to be, I want to be limber, or something like that. So that's not really what it's about. The other thing is that you'll often hear, I teach a class on religion violence. And students will often talk about, I'll talk about the ubiquity of religion and violence. And I started teaching this class in the wake of 9/11 to kind of combat notions, right, that Islam is inherently violent religion, et cetera, et cetera. And all commonplace for people to be like, oh, there's no violence in Buddhism, right? And that simply is not true. That Buddhist monks have been involved in nationalist violence all over the Indian subcontinent, in Tibet, in Sri Lanka. So it's not, Buddhists are human beings. So Buddhists are just as susceptible to nationalist politics and to the forces that are pushing global violence forward. The most recent, still ongoing, horrific form of Buddhist oppression and violence is the current treatment of the Rohingya Muslims, who are really in concentration camps, and are being subjected to indoctrination, training and, things like that. It's just absolutely egregious. So this notion that Buddhists are not involved in violence or somehow, that is a wrong notion. And it also, that's a way of also sort of simplifying and exoticizing Eastern religious traditions, which happens a lot in the West. Oh, they're more peaceful, they're more this. Oh, Hinduism has goddesses, so it's better than Christianity. It's like, well, okay, I hear these things constantly. And Buddhism isn't violent. No, people who are Buddhist aren't violent. Yeah. Everybody's human beings, right? So you find all these things everywhere. And then the last question that often comes up is Buddhism a religion? Right? There is no deity. So if your definition of religion includes belief in a higher power, right, or some kind of deity, Buddha does not set himself up as a deity, right? He's a charismatic individual like Jesus, but the belief did not develop about him that he himself was a deity. And so many people have argued, well, so some people say, well, it is a religion. So if you think of a religion as a worldview or a system of principles and understandings of the world that guide your life, if that's how you're understanding religion, well, then clearly it is a religion. If you think it has to believe in a higher power, if that's, the sine qua non for you of religion, that there's a divine beings, etc. Right? We haven't been talking about any of that, right? Then you would say, right, no, it's more a philosophical system. And I think that most Buddhists themselves would say it's a philosophical system. It's an ethical system. And so somebody asked me the other day, last week, can you be a Hindu and a Christian? And I would argue no, but can you be a Buddhist and a Christian? I would argue yes. And I would argue that many, many people are, or Jewish and Buddhist, right? Those kinds of things. So this is a common question though, and it comes up all the time in like Religion 101. Well, I have students do an exercise saying like, well, what's your definition of religion? Usually it's like, well, belief in a divine superhuman being. And it's like, okay, well, there are a lot of Jews who don't believe in God, who feel pretty religious and feel pretty Jewish, and there's a lot of Buddhists don't even have a God, right? So how do we think about that? So this comes up all the time with the question of whether or not it truly is a religion because of its non-theism, because it's the absence of it doesn't have a central God figure at all. Okay, so that is Buddhism. With the soup song of parallels with other traditions. And next week we will talk about Judaism, and then we'll talk about Islam. Because you got to talk about Judaism if you want to talk about Christianity, if you want to talk about Islam, it all comes out of Judaism. Okay, great.